In my 300 years as Senior Professor of Comparative Sports Theory at the Galactic Academy of Athletic Excellence, I had never encountered anything quite as barbaric as human rugby. Of course, now that it's become the most popular sport in 3 sectors, everyone claims they saw its potential from the start. But I was there when it all began, and let me tell you, we thought it was absolutely ridiculous. Perhaps I should introduce myself. I'm Professor Crixatol, holder of 7 degrees in non-contact sports philosophy and author of the groundbreaking thesis, Why Physical Competition Peaked with Zero-Gravity Chess. Like most sensible beings in the galaxy, I believed that true athletic achievement meant rising above our primitive instincts. Our most celebrated sports involved complex mathematical calculations, precise energy manipulation, and absolutely no touching. That all changed when the Academy accepted its first human student. Jake O'Malley arrived from Earth Colony 7 with what he called a rugby ball, an ellipsoid piece of primitive leather technology that immediately drew snickers from my advanced students. He was a stocky specimen, even for a human, with the kind of dense musculature that made our security scanners malfunction. While most species had evolved beyond the need for physical strength, humans seemed to revel in it. "But Professor," Jake argued during his first day in advanced sports theory, "how can you analyze Earth sports without including rugby or American football?" "Mr. O'Malley," I replied, using my most patient teaching tentacles, "we study athletics, not warfare." This drew the expected laughs from my students, particularly from Vectra, daughter of Admiral Zen and our most promising zero-gravity chess champion. She had a particular talent for making her nose ridges ripple in perfect expressions of disdain. "It's not warfare," Jake insisted, his face turning that fascinating shade of red that humans display when agitated. "It's a sophisticated test of strategy, teamwork, and skill." "Ah yes," Vectra chimed in, her voice dripping with precisely calculated amounts of scorn. "The sophisticated strategy of running directly into each other at high velocity. Truly, the pinnacle of sporting evolution." I should have known better than to let the conversation continue. In my centuries of teaching, I'd learned that humans have a peculiar reaction to mockery. Where most species would accept their obvious cultural inferiority with grace, humans tend to become motivated. Jake stood up, holding his leather ellipsoid with what I would later recognize as dangerous determination. "You think you understand sports?" he said, looking directly at Vectra. "You think floating in zero gravity, moving pieces on a board shows athletic superiority? I'll tell you what, give me 1 month to put together a proper rugby match. If you're not impressed, I'll withdraw from the Academy and write a formal apology about Earth's primitive sporting culture." The room fell silent, creating the perfect acoustic environment to hear Vectra's nose ridges snap into their most condescending position. "And if, by some impossible chance, we are impressed?" Jake grinned, displaying far too many teeth in the way humans do when they're about to cause trouble. "Then the Academy adds rugby to its official curriculum, and you have to be on the first alien team." I really should have stopped it there. As the senior professor, it was my duty to prevent such obviously disruptive proposals. But I must admit, I was curious. In 3 centuries of teaching, I'd never seen anyone challenge Vectra's sporting superiority. Besides, what harm could one primitive human game do to our sophisticated sporting culture? I really wish I'd remembered that humans have a saying about famous last words. Word of Jake's challenge spread through the Academy faster than a quantum transmission. Within days, our normally sophisticated halls were buzzing with discussions of scrums, tries, and other terminological barbarisms that made our linguistics department collectively shudder. Jake, meanwhile, had begun reaching out to human colonies across the sector. Every day, more thick-necked specimens arrived at our pristine campus, each carrying their own leather ellipsoids and speaking in incomprehensible sporting dialects. Ruck, Maul, and Hooker became regular additions to our universal translators, though I suspect several of our more sensitive translation AIs developed what humans would call nervous breakdowns in the process. Vectra, to her credit, approached the challenge with scientific precision. She assembled a team of our top sports theorists to analyze human rugby footage. Their first report was concerning. "Professor," she said, bursting into my office one morning, her nose ridges completely flat with distress, "there seems to be a malfunction in the historical archives. The humans appear to be deliberately colliding with each other repeatedly, while fighting over the ellipsoid." I adjusted my teaching tentacles into their most reassuring position. "Now, Vectra, surely there must be some logical explanation. Perhaps it's a form of ritualized combat, like the ancient Voltairean chess matches where players would occasionally jostle each other's anti-gravity chairs." "No, Professor, you don't understand. They're forming organized geometric formations for the sole purpose of pushing against each other. They call it a scrum, and it appears to be voluntary." I watched as she pulled up a holographic display of what appeared to be 16 humans locked together in a configuration that defied both physics and common sense. "And this is considered normal?" I asked. "According to the archives, this particular game was a, quote, friendly match." Her nose ridges curled in obvious distress. "I don't want to see what an unfriendly match looks like. But our concerns were nothing compared to the reaction of the Academy Board when Jake submitted his formal request for a regulation-size rugby pitch. The maintenance drones nearly short-circuited trying to comprehend the concept of deliberately maintaining a field of actual dirt and grass inside our climate-controlled facility. "But why can't we just use a zero-gravity field with holographic terrain?" asked board member Piexanil, their sensory fronds waving in agitation. "Because," Jake explained with what I was learning to recognize as dangerous patience, "rugby is meant to be played on actual ground, with actual grass, and yes, even actual weather." "Weather?" The entire board rippled in collective horror. "You mean to tell us you want to play this sport outdoors, in the elements, like animals?" Jake's grin should have warned us. "Oh yes," he said, "and if we're really lucky, it might even rain." I don't think I've ever seen a board meeting adjourn so quickly. As the members fled the chamber, Jake turned to me with an expression that humans call puppy dog eyes, though I've never understood what infant canines have to do with persuasion. "Professor," he said, "I know this all seems bizarre to you, but trust me, once you see a real rugby match, you'll understand why it's more than just primitive violence. It's about trust, cooperation, and pushing beyond your limits. Also, there's a pretty good chance Vectra's nose ridges will get muddy, and I know you'd pay good credits to see that." I hate to admit it, but he had a point about Vectra's nose ridges. Perhaps that's why I found myself approving the field construction request, against all better judgment, and several Academy safety regulations. As I watched the maintenance drones begrudgingly installing actual grass, and muttering binary curses about prehistoric working conditions, I couldn't shake the feeling that our perfectly ordered sporting world was about to change forever. I just had no idea how right I was. The month leading up to the match was, to use a human phrase, absolutely bonkers. Jake's team of human players began practicing on our newly installed grass field, creating scenes that drew crowds of horrified yet fascinated spectators. Our medical staff initially tried to rush onto the field every time someone was tackled, until Jake had to explain that lying on the ground gasping for breath was, in fact, a normal part of the game. "But they're injuring each other," protested our head medic, Dr. Vin, whose crystalline structure vibrated with anxiety every time a tackle occurred. "On purpose." "They're not injured," Jake assured him. "They're just winded. Their internal oxygen processing systems are malfunctioning, and you want them to continue." Dr. Vin's crystal facets began stress fracturing. "What kind of barbaric endurance ritual is this?" Meanwhile, Vectra had moved from horror to methodical analysis. She spent hours studying rugby footage, trying to decode what she called the primitive algorithm of organized chaos. Her research notes became increasingly frantic. Day 3. Players deliberately rotate the ellipsoid backwards to advance forwards. Counterintuitive, possibly symbolic of humans' contrary nature. Day 7. Discovered concept of dummy pass. Humans deliberately deceive opponents about ellipsoid location. Unsportsmanlike. Must consult ethics board. Day 12 witnessed first ruck in practice. Multiple humans fighting over fallen player. Asked medical staff to prepare crisis counseling for traumatized spectators. Day 15. Players apparently form ritualistic bond through shared suffering. Human team seen celebrating bruises after practice. Concerning evidence of masochistic tendencies. But it was the concept of the scrum that really captured our academic community's attention. A group of theoretical physicists spent an entire week trying to calculate the mathematical impossibility of 8 humans working as a single pushing unit. They eventually published a paper titled The Unified Theory of Human Insanity, a biomechanical analysis of the Rugby scrum. The humans, for their part, seemed to be having the time of their lives. They embraced our confusion with what Jake called theatrical flair, sometimes exaggerating their post-tackle groans just to watch Dr. Vin's crystal structure nearly shatter with concern. They named their team the Barbarians, a choice that did nothing to ease our faculty's concerns. The weather, at least, remained perfectly controlled through all this, until Jake submitted his final match-day request. "You want us to do what?" I asked, certain my translator had malfunctioned. "Turn off the weather control systems," Jake repeated. "Rugby's meant to be played in the elements. Natural grass, natural sky, natural weather." "But," my teaching tentacles twisted in distress, "it's forecasted to rain that day." Jake's grin reached what I previously thought were anatomically impossible dimensions. "Perfect. There's nothing better than a muddy rugby match." I looked out at our immaculate grass field, thought about our pristine sporting facilities, and imagined Vectra's precious nose ridges covered in mud. Against all logic and several sections of the Academy's Health and Safety Charter, I approved the request. As I watched the maintenance drones preemptively book themselves for post-traumatic systems therapy, I realized we had passed the point of no return. The galaxy's most prestigious sporting institution was about to host what our physics department had dubbed Human Collision Event Alpha. And somewhere in the back of my many-lobed mind, a tiny voice wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, we were about to learn something important about the true nature of sport. Either that, or we were about to witness the most sophisticated mass self-destruction ritual in galactic history. The day of the match arrived with what Jake enthusiastically called perfect rugby weather, a statement that caused our meteorological department to submit their collective resignations in protest. Dark clouds loomed over our normally climate-controlled campus, and the air held the kind of moisture content that made our atmospheric scientists twitch uncontrollably. Despite, or perhaps because of, the threatening weather, it seemed the entire academy had turned out to witness the spectacle. The stands around our newly installed grass field were packed with faculty, students, and what appeared to be every medical professional within 50 parsecs. Dr. Vin had set up an emergency triage center that looked capable of handling a small war. The human team emerged first, performing what they called a warm-up, but what our physics department desperately tried to classify as a new form of controlled chaos theory. Jake led them through a series of stretches and practice runs that had our medical staff preemptively updating their malpractice insurance. Then came the opposing team, a hastily assembled group of the Academy's most athletic students, led by Vectra herself. They had spent the last month studying rugby footage and practicing basic moves, though they still looked about as comfortable as a Voltairean at a hugging convention. "Professor," Vectra approached me just before kickoff, her nose ridges quivering with what might have been excitement or terror. "Is it true that the humans refuse the neural safety buffers?" "I'm afraid so," I replied, trying to keep my teaching tentacles from nervously tangling. "They insisted that protective force fields would, and I quote, ruin the spirit of the game." She glanced at the gathering storm clouds and the weather controls. A loud rumble of thunder answered her question. I saw several of her teammates jump, while the humans actually cheered. The game began with what the humans called a kickoff, a relatively straightforward procedure that somehow immediately devolved into what looked like a small-scale invasion. The first time two players collided at full speed, Dr. Vin's crystalline structure nearly shattered from stress. But it was the first scrum that truly tested our collective sanity. "What are they doing?" Vectra asked in horror as the humans packed together in that notorious formation we'd studied in theory, but never quite believed would happen in practice. "Preparing to push," Jake said cheerfully as he prepared to feed the ball into the tunnel. What followed defied every principle of civilized sport we'd ever taught. 8 humans locked against 8 academy students, pushing and grunting in what our physics department would later describe as controlled gravitational insanity. To everyone's surprise, especially their own, the academy team managed to hold their ground. That's when the rain started, and I've seen some strange sights in my 3 centuries of teaching, but nothing quite compares to the look of joy on the humans' faces when the first drops fell. The pitch quickly turned muddy, and what had started as a structured game descended into something that looked like choreographed chaos in slow motion. The truly astonishing part? The academy team was actually getting into it. I watched in amazement as Vectra, her nose ridges now completely caked with mud, executed a perfect tackle. She rose from the ground with a very un-Vectra-like grin on her face. "Did you see that, Professor?" she shouted, covered head to toe in mud. "I stopped him, just like in the training videos." Before I could respond, she was off again, diving into another ruck with enthusiasm that would have scandalized her zero-gravity chess teammates. The rest of her team seemed to be following suit, abandoning centuries of non-contact sports philosophy in favor of what Jake kept calling good, clean fun. Though I noted with irony that clean was no longer an applicable adjective to anyone on the field. By halftime, the score was surprisingly close, humans 10, academy 8. More surprisingly, no one had died. Dr. Vin had only fainted twice, and our physics department had filled 3 quantum computers with new theories about human pain tolerance. As the teams huddled under shelter for the break, I couldn't help but notice something extraordinary. The academy team wasn't just surviving this barbaric sport, they were enjoying it. Vectra, particularly, seemed to have undergone some kind of transformation. Her usually perfect posture was covered in mud, her nose ridges were askew, and she was sporting what humans call a bloody nose, and yet she looked happier than I'd ever seen her during any zero-gravity chess match. The rain intensified as we prepared for the second half, and I heard Jake shout something about real rugby weather now. Looking at the gleam in Vectra's eyes, I realized we were about to witness either a sporting revolution or the end of 3 centuries of dignified athletic tradition, possibly both. The second half began in what can only be described as a monsoon. Our maintenance drones had gone into full panic mode, transmitting increasingly hysterical status reports about soil integrity and grassroots structures. The pitch had transformed into something resembling a swamp, and the players, both human and alien, had become nearly indistinguishable mud creatures. "This," announced Jake, beaming through the rain, "is proper rugby weather." Our meteorological department, watching from their hastily constructed crisis center, collectively wept. The humans apparently evolved for these exact conditions seemed to come alive in the mud and rain. They launched into something they called a rolling maul, a terrifying formation of bodies moving as one mass through the muck. Our physics department's quantum computers briefly achieved sentience, trying to calculate the fluid dynamics involved, then immediately shut down in protest. But the academy team, led by an increasingly mud-covered and enthusiastic Vectra, refused to back down. They had spent a month studying human rugby footage, and now, in the pouring rain, something clicked. Perhaps it was the mud washing away centuries of proper sporting etiquette. Perhaps it was the primal joy of purely physical competition. Or perhaps it was just the fact that, as Vectra later explained, tackling is really, really fun. The score grew closer, humans 15, academy 13. The stands, despite the rain, were packed with spectators who had long since abandoned any pretense of dignified observation. Even the most prestigious professors were shouting rugby terms with questionable accuracy. I heard the Dean of Theoretical Physics scream, "Scrum them harder," which I'm fairly certain isn't actual rugby terminology. Then came the moment that would be remembered in academy sporting history forever. With 5 minutes left, Vectra found herself with the ball, running toward what humans call the try line. 2 human players converged on her position. In zero-gravity chess, this would be the moment to calculate probabilities and make the statistically optimal move. In rugby, apparently, it was time for what Jake later called pure sporting instinct. Vectra, her nose ridges caked with mud and her usually immaculate uniform, now a symphony in brown, did something that made the entire crowd gasp. She lowered her shoulder and ran straight at the larger human player. Time seemed to slow down. Our medical staff began preemptively filing paperwork. Dr. Vin's crystal structure vibrated at a frequency that briefly disrupted local communications. The physics department's last functioning quantum computer achieved enlightenment, calculated the probability of Vectra's survival, and immediately applied for transfer to a more sensible universe. The collision, when it came, was spectacular. Vectra, applying what she later described as applied momentum physics with extreme prejudice, somehow bounced off the human defender, spun through the tackle of the second player and dove across the try line. The sound of her score was drowned out by the roar from the crowd, and the sound of Dr. Vin finally shattering into 1,000 anxious crystals. The Academy had taken the lead 18-15 with minutes to play. What followed was either the most glorious or most horrifying display of sport ever witnessed at our institution, depending on who you ask. The humans, facing their first defeat, launched attack after attack. The Academy team, led by Vectra's now terrifyingly accurate tackling, defended as if their lives depended on it. The rain, if anything, intensified. Our weather control systems, overwhelmed by the sheer meteorological drama of the moment, initiated emergency shutdown procedures. The maintenance drones, having exhausted their entire vocabulary of binary profanity, began composing electronic poetry about the apocalypse. As the final seconds ticked down, Jake made one last desperate run toward the try line. Vectra, covered in mud but moving with the precision of a zero-gravity chess grandmaster, lined up the perfect tackle. The 2 leaders, human and alien, met in a collision that our physics department would later use to rewrite several laws of thermodynamics. The whistle blew, the final score stood, Academy 18, Humans 15. The crowd erupted. The maintenance drones surrendered to the inevitable and began drafting their resignations. And Vectra, standing in the middle of the mud-covered battlefield that had once been our pristine sporting field, raised her arms in triumph, her nose ridges arranged in an expression of pure joy that would have scandalized her zero-gravity chess teammates. The rain, as if acknowledging the moment, finally began to ease, and in the muddy aftermath of what our historical department would later name the Great Collision, I realized that sport, and our academy, would never be quite the same again. The changes happened faster than a quantum scoring calculation. Within a week of what became known as the Mud Bowl, the Academy Board received over 300 applications from students wanting to join the newly formed rugby program. Our medical department, led by a fully reconstructed Dr. Vin, had to expand their facilities to handle what they now classified as enthusiastic sporting injuries, rather than emergencies. Vectra, to nobody's surprise, became the captain of the Academy's first official rugby team. Her zero-gravity chess trophies now share shelf space with what humans call a mouthguard, a protective device that she displays with far more pride than any of her previous sporting achievements. The maintenance drones, after extensive therapy and a generous hazard pay agreement, eventually adapted to the concept of maintaining actual grass. They even developed a certain pride in their mud-covered charging stations, though they still transmit mournful binary dirges every time it rains. Our physics department, having finally reconciled rugby with the laws of thermodynamics, published a groundbreaking paper titled The Vectra Equation, a unified theory of human-alien sporting cooperation. It's now required reading for first-year students, along with a medical waiver and a permission slip from their genetic ancestors. But perhaps the most significant change was in our sporting philosophy itself. We had spent centuries believing that athletic evolution meant moving away from physical contact pursuing ever more abstract forms of competition. Then humans came along with their leather ellipsoid and taught us that sometimes, just sometimes, the most sophisticated approach is to embrace the fundamental joy of running straight at your problems. Jake stayed on as our first human rugby coach, though he did apologize for accidentally creating what he calls the most aggressively enthusiastic rugby culture in the galaxy. The Academy's team, now known as the Muddy Philosophers, has a waiting list longer than a Voltairean meditation session. As for me, I've had to revise my thesis on the evolution of sport. Why physical competition peaked with zero-gravity chess has been retired in favor of my new research. Contact Sports and Cultural Evolution, a study in controlled chaos theory. It's not as elegant as my previous work, but like rugby itself, it has a certain muddy charm. We still play zero-gravity chess, of course, we're not barbarians. But now, on rainy days, you might notice even our most sophisticated students glancing hopefully at the rugby pitch. And if you listen carefully, you can hear Vectra leading her team in what she insists is a traditional human sporting cry. Scrum them harder. She's still working on the terminology. Looking back, I realize that sports, like societies, don't always evolve in straight lines. Sometimes they loop back around, picking up mud and bruises and joy along the way. Sometimes the most civilized thing we can do is embrace a little controlled chaos. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best way to advance is to pick up a leather ellipsoid and run straight ahead, regardless of what the physics department has to say about it. Though I do wish someone had warned me about the maintenance costs of real grass. Some aspects of human sports, I fear, will never truly make sense. End of report, Professor Crixatol, Senior Professor of Comparative Sports Theory, Galactic Academy of Athletic Excellence, currently on sabbatical to coach the Academy's second rugby team, much to everyone's surprise, including my own.